Greetings, brothers and sisters in Christ. This is another discussion rooted in Genesis. In this case, we're answering the question, is there evidence that the creation is young? If you've been with me now for, I think, 7 weeks in our study, and you understand my position on Genesis, I believe the genealogies taken in the Old Testament, in particular in Genesis, as well as the New Testament, are to be taken literally. I really believe there's not many places where you can shoehorn additional people into the timeline. So at best, at the very maximum, we're looking at a creation that's 10,000 years old. For sure, it's greater than 6,000 years old. As you look at this diagram, again, you can see how the clear patriarchal line here from Adam to Seth to Enos, but equally you can see the flood 1,656 years after Adam was created. And you can see Abraham on the scene at almost 2,000 years after Adam was created. Equally, as you think about this, it feathers together real nice with the New Testament. Again, Abraham existed about, again, we're using rough numbers, about 2,000 years after Adam was created. He lived about 2000 BC. So again, greater than 6,000, but less than 10,000. And again, I believe these genealogies can be taken literally. And again, sometimes there are people missing, but oftentimes we know who they are. And even if there are some people missing along the way, they're not many, and you cannot account for a large number of years. So greatest would be 10,000. So the biblical timeline looks something like this. God created everything in 6 literal days. He created light, he created energy, he created matter, he created space, he created everything in 6 literal days. The flood, 1,656 years after the creation, followed by the law, followed by Christ going to the cross to die for our sins. The church age, again, a creation that's greater than 6,000 years old, but less than 10,000. This is in stark contrast to the current evolutionary timeline. Again, we've talked about this. I won't say much more other than to say this timeline is in flux. It will change. The James Webb Space Telescope is going to demand that it change. But again, it's not changing to something better. It's just changing to keep fitting and making accommodations for what we see in real life. Now, maybe you're thinking, okay, I saw the Big Bang video. The theory does have serious issues, and it does not seem to be solidly based on science. In particular, something from nothing, inflation, dark matter, and dark energy appear to be unscientific and really accommodations for a failed theory. I watched the video on dinosaurs. It does appear that they are not millions of years old. In fact, it's unlikely they're hundreds of thousands of years old. The evidence of bone materials, blood cells, blood vessels, and even DNA really demand that. I watched the supposed evolution of man, and I agree, as you look closely at the evidence, all we see is man and primates. So you're kind of tracking with me probably, and you said, hey, I've watched the video on where the old ages come from, and I was surprised to see how much theory drives the data and really how much circular reasoning is there, especially as it relates to the geologic column or the supposed evolution of man. You probably also agree that radiometric dating has serious flaws. It doesn't work. When we date the age of things we know their age, we get erroneous dates, so it's hard to trust the method when we date things that we do not know the age. Also, you may have watched the video on carbon-14 dating, and you probably agree it's more reliable, but it has limitations as well. Equally, the existence of carbon-14 in fossils, diamonds, and coal all point to the reality that these things are not hundreds of thousands of years old. They're not millions of years old. They're indeed young. That's the presence of carbon-14 demands that. So you're thinking, I get it, but I get that the Bible seems to teach a young creation, and I hear what you're saying, between 6,000 and 10,000 years old, but you're probably thinking, let's be honest, 10,000 years is very young. And that probably gets to the question, is there evidence that points to a very young creation? Because everything you keep leading to leads to that. And so obviously that's a great question. And so honestly, everything I've done up till now has been moving towards this question. It's been moving towards answering this question. It was all setting the groundwork to deal with this question. And so now, not only is there evidence, but there's many different forms of evidence from various areas that point to the fact that the earth, and indeed the entire creation, is very young. Now, before we look at some of the evidence, I do want to make two important points. Remember, science is knowledge about the natural world that's based on facts learned through experiments and observation. And that's Merriam-Webster's dictionary definition, not mine. Equally, coming from the English Oxford Living Dictionaries, the scientific method of which science is based on is a method of procedure that has characterized natural science since the 17th century. It consists in systematic observation, measurements, experiments, and the formulation, testing, and modification of hypotheses. That is what science and the scientific method is supposed to be. Science does not produce ages. If we push science for an age, we must remember that it has limitations. It can only produce a min, max, or a range estimate. It makes many different assumptions based on the method we're using, and the more those assumptions are violated, the less reliable our supposed age will be. And we have no way of knowing that all of the assumptions are not violated. And often we don't know which ones are violated. We're really hoping they're not, but we really have no way in most cases of knowing. As the assumptions are violated, the age can become completely erroneous. For example, when you talk about radiometric dating, just a small amount, a very small amount of a daughter product at the rock formation at the time the rock was formed can potentially give massively erroneous ages. For example, potassium-argon dating has a half-life of 1.25 billion years. Even a small amount of argon in the rock at formation will give the appearance of great ages incorrectly. Uranium-238 to lead-206, a half-life of 4.47 billion years. Again, a small amount of daughter product when the rock is formed will give the appearance of massive age that it does not have. Thorium-232 to lead-208, the half-life is 14 billion years. Same issue. Rubidium, strontium, the half-life is 48.8 billion years. The same issue. Just a small amount of daughter product will completely blow these ages up, and that's part of, I believe, what we're seeing. If you want to know the age of someone or something, you do not use science. You need history. And here's my point. We have history. We have reliable history. The Bible provides detailed history, detailed, reliable history that can help us answer the question that we're seeking to answer. I'm just going to jump into Genesis chapter 5. This is the book of the genealogy of Adam, the Toledoth, the history. In the day that God created man, he made him in the likeness of God, Genesis 5:1. So in the book of Genesis, we have the genealogy from Adam all the way to the death of Joseph. Looking at Genesis 5:3 and 4. Adam lived 130 years, and he begot a son in his own likeness, after his own image, and named him Seth. After he begot Seth, the days of Adam were 800 years, and he had sons and daughters. Genesis 5:3 and 4. So the patriarchal model that we find in the book of Genesis looks something like this. You have birth. You have the birth of the next patriarch, that this many years after he was born. Then you have the remainder of his years. And then you have the total years. And then in that, you're told, oh, and there were other sons and daughters. So it's important to understand what you're being told here and what you're not being told. You're not being told about the other children, the other boys and girls, other than that there were. You're not told when or how many. You're being told when the patriarch, the next patriarch, was born, and then how long he lived overall, and how many years between that patriarch marker and the end. But you're not being told how many children, how many were boys, how many were girls. You're not told any of that. Now let me ask you a question. As you think about this, if you lived 900 years old, like Adam and Eve, like all the early patriarchs, with a few exceptions, and there were no defects in the DNA, or at least very few, and there was only one very primitive method of birth control, and God had told you to go forth and multiply and fill the earth, and the more kids you had, the lighter the workload, How many kids on average do you think an average family had? 6? 10? 20? 40? We'll talk about this in class, but what you'll see is the globe would explode in population pretty quick because of the long lives of these early patriarchs. But this is the model we find in Genesis, the book that's proven itself, the Bible, to be absolutely reliable. And so with few exceptions, this is how the model looks in Genesis. Seth lived 105 years and begot Enosh. After he begot Enosh, Seth lived 807 years and he had sons and daughters. Again, you see the model. You understand what you're being told, but you understand what you're not being told. Here's Adam to Seth to Enosh. Again, what you're not being told is how many other sons and daughters. You can see the flood there. You can see it looks like Methuselah's life kind of bumps up against the flood. It is interesting to note that no one goes through the flood except Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. No one else actually goes through the flood. That is very interesting. We'll talk about that in class. As you think about Methuselah dying right there at the flood, it's very interesting what Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown in their commentary said. They said his name means when he dies, it is sent. But again, as you tie all this together through both the genealogies of the Old Testament and the New Testament, you clearly end up with a young creation. But to the question, is there evidence that points to a young creation? So absolutely. Let's start in our solar system. The next few video clips are Spike Bassar's. He has a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering from the University of Massachusetts, graduate work in physics. For a number of years, he was an engineer in the U.S. military space program. He's created just a fantastic 3-part DVD series entitled What You Aren't Being Told About Astronomy. I'm just grabbing a few things from that. There's so much more that we could go with, but let's just start there and sort of work our way through some of the things that are presented in that video set. We'll start with Mercury, starting closest to our sun. It's the smallest planet in our solar system, only slightly larger than our moon. It's the closest planet to the sun. It's actually in a gravitational lock with the sun and rotates in a 3-to-2 spin-orbit resonance. So it rotates on its axis 3 times for every 2 revolutions around the sun. No other planet does this. It is a planet of extremes. On the side that's facing the sun, temperatures can reach 800 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hot enough to melt lead. On the dark side, and again, it's slowly rotating in that locked ratio, temperatures can plummet to 280 degrees below zero. It is not a habitable place. It has a very elliptical orbit. It gets as close to the sun as 29 million miles and as far away as 43 million miles. And it orbits the sun every 88 days. Now, there are a number of items about Mercury that deny evolutionary theory. But there's another issue. Mercury gives clear evidence of it being very young.
Then, in 2008, the Messenger spacecraft arrived at Mercury, our first in-depth study of the planet in over 30 years, and we got a treasure trove of new information. Evolutionists had hoped that the new data would solve their problems. Instead, the problems became far worse. Messenger created several new challenges for secular models. First of all, Messenger found that Mercury has a lot of volatile elements, like sulfur and potassium. This discredits the large impact hypothesis, because these elements are very volatile. A violent collision like this would have vaporized these elements. They would have escaped into space, and they wouldn't be on Mercury today. But they are on Mercury today. Therefore, there was no large impact, and evolutionists can no longer explain Mercury's large metallic core. Second, Mercury appears to have lots of sulfur, a higher concentration than any other rocky planet. This sulfur causes other problems for evolutionary models. The nebula theory says that volatile elements like sulfur can't be there. As one study noted, chemical condensation models indicate that sulfur cannot condense in the primordial solar nebula at the heliocentric distance of Mercury. But there it is on Mercury anyway. Third, Messenger found that Mercury's magnetic field is decaying. It decreased by almost 8% in just 35 years or so. At this rate, it loses half its strength about every 320 years. If Mercury were really billions of years old, it shouldn't have a magnetic field at all. Now we see that it not only has a field, the field is also decaying rapidly. This makes the field look very young, like the planet was initially magnetized just a few thousand years ago. It can't have been decaying like this for billions of years, because it would have been impossibly strong far less than 1 million years ago. By the way, the decaying field was not a surprise to creationists, because a physicist named Dr. Russell Humphreys had predicted it ahead of time, based on the creation account in the Bible.
So again, the magnetic field there on Mercury screams this young planet. It is interesting. You'll hear more about this, but Dr. Humphreys predicted they would find the magnetic situation there on Mercury that they found. Moving away from Mercury, obviously Earth, third planet from the sun, the only planet that harbors life. As we talked about, one moon that is really necessary for life on this planet. It causes the ocean tides, it stabilizes the Earth's orientation on its axis. Average distance to the sun is about 92 million miles, and it takes light about 8 minutes to arrive here on Earth from the sun. It's tilted on its axis. That provides our seasonal variations. Interestingly enough, about 71% of the Earth is covered with water. If you were to flatten the Earth out, the water would cover the planet 1.4 miles deep. The Earth has many issues that defy the evolutionary model, but equally it has evidence that it too is a young planet.
Let's talk instead about the Earth as a planet. Other than its age, does it match evolutionary theories? No, in many ways it doesn't. First of all, Earth's magnetic field causes all sorts of problems for evolution. Our magnetic field looks sort of like the field that would be generated if there was a giant bar magnet inside the Earth. Of course, there is no bar magnet inside of our planet. So where does the field come from? We've already discussed how magnetic fields are supposedly generated by fluid motions inside the planets. We've also discussed how this idea doesn't necessarily work, especially for Mercury. Well, it's hard to make it work for the Earth too, even though the Earth is the planet it was invented to explain. The American Geophysical Union website quotes a study that says this: "The mechanism for generating the geomagnetic field remains one of the central unsolved problems in geoscience." An even bigger problem, though, is that our magnetic field is decaying. For as long as we've been measuring it, its energy has fallen continuously. It loses half its energy about every 1400 years or so. Now, you might have heard that the Earth's magnetic field has flipped in the past, that north and south magnetic poles have swapped. That's true, but it's not what we're talking about here. We aren't talking about the strength of the field at any one place on the Earth. We're talking about all the energy in the field overall, and that energy is fading fast. Since it's getting weaker over time, this means it was stronger in the past. If you could travel backwards in time, the field would double its energy every 1400 years you traveled. Of course, there's a definite limit on how strong it could possibly have been. It turns out that the Earth's magnetic field could only be tens of thousands of years old at the most, not thousands of millions. Oh, and evolutionary dynamo theories can't explain any of this, of course. That's why one evolutionist recently wrote, "Magnetism is almost as much of a puzzle now as it was when William Gilbert wrote his classic text concerning magnetism, magnetic bodies, and the great magnet Earth in 1600. So, despite 400 years of research, evolutionists can't figure out how the Earth could possibly have a magnetic field. Maybe we should just accept that our planet was created?
Again, I would tell you the magnetic field screams that it's a young planet. As we look at our moon, again, it travels around our planet every 27.322 days. On average, it's about 240,000 miles from the Earth. Again, it is our single satellite. It's in what's called tidal lock with the planet, which means the same side is always facing the Earth. It is the fifth largest satellite in the solar system. Ganymede, moon of Jupiter, is the largest satellite in the solar system. The moon also provides evidence that it too is young.
All along, there's been a lot of evidence that the moon can't be billions of years old. For example, this is the Aristarchus Plateau. This is one of many locations on the moon that have been controversial for a long time. For centuries, people have seen flashes and temporary glows of light in these locations. These events don't last long, so it's been very difficult to photograph them. But we have written accounts of them going back to the 1500s. It seems that the moon is still geologically active, releasing gas from volcanic vents. This is the Eratosthenes crater, another location where unusual sightings have occurred. Evolutionists have rejected all these sightings as nonsense. In their models, the moon's volcanic activity stopped about 3.2 billion years ago. The moon is old, cold, and dead. It can't be geologically active, or so they've always said. Finally, though, all the accumulating evidence became too much. In 1968, NASA released its chronological catalog of reported lunar events. This report listed 579 separate sightings of anomalous events on the moon. A couple of years later, the Apollo 15 mission even measured radon gas coming from the Aristarchus crater. Apparently, the moon is still geologically active. This makes perfect sense if it was only a few thousand years old. It's not old, cold, and dead, after all. The funny thing is, for the most part, evolutionists still won't admit any of this. In 2006, a study was published that said, well, we used to think that all geological activity stopped there 3.2 billion years ago, but now we admit we were wrong. It continued until 10 million years ago. They just have to stick with the millions of years. They just can't admit that the moon is young, and that its geological activity is still going on today. After all, if the moon was young, then the Bible would be right, and they don't want that. There's still one final problem with the evolutionist model that we haven't discussed yet. When our astronauts went to the moon, they brought lots of experiments with them. One of those experiments was called LLR, or Lunar Laser Ranging. These were special mirrors that the astronauts left behind on the moon. These are the locations where the Apollo missions landed. Apollo 11, 14, and 15 were the 3 missions that left behind the LLR reflectors. The reflectors look like this. Scientists on the Earth can fire a laser at one of these reflectors, and if the laser hits the target directly, which is really hard to do, as you can imagine, but they are able to do this, then the laser bounces back to Earth. Scientists then measure how long the light took to return, and then they figure out exactly how far away the moon is from us. This is still being done today, by the way. It's the only Apollo experiment that's still going on. Here's why this is important. Scientists have discovered that the moon is moving further away from us every year. This was already suspected before Apollo, but now we've been able to measure it. So why is this happening? It's because the moon is raising ocean tides on the Earth. This causes our ocean to bulge towards the moon. However, the Earth is spinning underneath the bulge and pulling it forward. The bulge itself then exerts a gravitational pull on the moon, which accelerates it and moves it outward in its orbit. That's a complicated process, but don't worry about the details. The important part is this. The moon is moving away from the Earth at about 3.8 centimeters per year. That's about 1.5 inches each year. We've measured this for years, and we know exactly why it's happening. 1.5 inches per year doesn't sound like much, but the way this works, it would have been receding faster in the past. Looking backwards in time, the moon would have been much closer to the Earth than today. In fact, calculations show that the moon would have been touching the Earth only 1.5 billion years ago. Obviously, this is impossible. Obviously, the moon can't have been orbiting the Earth for 4 billion years, as evolutionists claim. By the way, I should mention that evolutionists have been trying to solve this problem. There are some articles floating around on the internet that say this isn't a problem for evolution anymore. But those articles are wrong. If you're curious why, you can go to www.creationastronomy.com for details.
We'll talk more about the regression of the moon here in a moment. Let's get through the rest of our solar system. As you think about the moon, we talked about this side, the side that faces us. There's the side that faces away from us, or what we often refer to as the dark side of the moon, the side that's facing away from us. It's really not dark. It's just the side we don't see. What's interesting, these impact craters are much more prominent on the side that faces us than the side that does not face us. Now, there's craters, impact craters on both sides, but the massive impact craters are on the side of the moon that faces us. Why in the world would that be? Well, I'll talk about that later. So the moon is moving away from the Earth at a rate of 1.5 inches a year. Now, that's definitely slow, But 1.45 billion years ago, the moon would have been touching the Earth. Now, obviously, that's impossible. The moon cannot ever be that close. In fact, it's theorized that if the moon got to about 11,500 miles from the Earth's tidal forces would actually tear the moon apart, and obviously the moon would bombard the Earth. That would be a complete disaster. The bottom line is, as you play this movie back, at about 1.2 billion years ago, is where that close the moon would have been tore apart by the gravity from the Earth. So obviously the moon has not been receding away from us for 1.2 billion years. It's much younger than that. Again, I read about this first in the book called In the Beginning. But again, max age based on what we're talking about, about 1.2 billion would be the maximum. And again, it's nothing near that old. This does help explain, though, what happened to the tall dinosaurs. Yeah, they were mooned, exactly. So let's continue on in our solar system. Two of the gas giants, Uranus and Neptune. First, both of these completely defy the evolutionary model. And even their formation is not possible based on the solar nebular model. Now, you probably never heard that, but it's true nonetheless. Equally, both give evidence that they are young. Now, Uranus is 1.8 billion miles from the sun. It orbits the sun every 84 years. So again, if you were to live 2 years old on Uranus, you've done something. Neptune is 2.8 billion miles from the sun. It orbits the sun every 165 years. But more than that, more than just interesting facts, they both show evidence of being young.
First of all, Uranus is one of the 4 giant Jovian planets. The other 3 all generate energy. They radiate more energy into space than they receive from the sun. Uranus is the only giant planet that doesn't do this. But why doesn't it? After all, these planets all supposedly formed at the same time, from the same materials, by the same natural processes. That means they should have turned out roughly the same. But Uranus is very different than the others in this important area. Another problem was discovered when Voyager flew by Uranus and measured the planet's magnetic field. Evolutionists had predicted that Uranus wouldn't have a magnetic field, but it does. Now, creationists weren't surprised when Uranus was found to have a magnetic field. 2 years before the Voyager probe reached Uranus, Dr. Russell Humphreys, who is a Bible-believing physicist, had predicted the planet would have a magnetic field. Since the Bible says the Earth was made of water, Dr. Humphreys said, "What if all the planets were originally created from water? That would have certain implications for their magnetic fields today, 6,000 years later." So he calculated approximately how strong that field would be today. And when Voyager reached Uranus and took measurements, the evolutionists were wrong, and the creation-based prediction was right. There's more we could say about Uranus if we had the time. But before we leave this planet, I have to share with you one of my favorite objects in the solar system, Uranus's moon, Miranda. Miranda is a tiny little moon. It's only about 300 miles across, but it's one of the strangest objects in the solar system. Pity the poor evolutionist who has to explain this thing. The entire moon looks like a patchwork quilt, like it was glued together from a jumble of different pieces. How many different types of terrain can you identify here? There's long strips of rugged terrain, side by side with terrain that's smoother but more heavily cratered. Here's another example. Look at how dramatically the terrain changes from one section to another. It really looks like the moon was assembled from a bunch of separate pieces. Some sections look like someone painted it with a giant paintbrush. Other sections have very dramatic terrain, with canyons several miles deep. Let's look more closely at that cliff on the right. This cliff is about 6 miles high. Imagine standing at the top and looking down. And what's with that big check mark anyway? It's almost as if the creator said, "Ha! Let him try to explain this one." As one evolutionist said, "No one predicted anything looking like Miranda." Another said, "The central problem in modeling the thermal histories of the Uranian satellites is accounting for Miranda." So how do evolutionists explain Miranda? You're probably expecting me to say they explain it with an asteroid collision. Nope, not this time. Miranda is so weird, even the evolutionists admit that an asteroid collision won't help them. Instead, some evolutionists propose 5 collisions. Here's a quote from a NASA website. Scientists believe that Miranda may have been shattered as many as 5 times during its evolution. After each shattering, the moon would have reassembled from the remains of its former self, with portions of the core exposed and portions of the surface buried. If this sounds like nonsense, it's because it is. Even other evolutionists recognize that this tiny moon wouldn't necessarily survive one collision, never mind 5. As one evolutionary astronomer wrote, although some sort of collisional disruption appears to be required, it's not obvious that the present terrain, with relief up to 20 kilometers, would survive catastrophic disruption and reassembly. Maybe that's why that NASA website, after telling you about the 5 collisions, says this: Miranda's appearance can be explained by theories, but the real reason is still unknown. So first, they give you a theory, and then admit they actually don't know what happened. In other words, they made up a story and told it to you, even though they know it's not true. Wouldn't it be better just to acknowledge that these objects were created?
So not only does Uranus have a magnetic field as Dr. Russell Humphreys predicted that it would, again, which defies an old age, but 3 of the gas giants are radiating more heat than they're receiving from the sun. That's possible if they're thousands or tens of thousands of years old. That's impossible if they're millions of years old. Again, the solar system is screaming that it's absolutely young. This is Neptune, again, one of the 4 gas giants.
We've seen that over and over again, the magnetic fields in the solar system have falsified evolutionary models. Well, Neptune is no different. We had a hint of the problem already before our first spacecraft even reached Neptune. When Voyager 2 was on its way to Neptune, it visited Uranus first. I already told you that according to evolution, Uranus wasn't supposed to have much of a magnetic field, but it does. There was another surprise, though, that I didn't mention. Not only was Uranus's magnetic field much stronger than the evolutionists expected, it was also tilted and offset from the center of the planet. Evolutionists couldn't make sense of this at all. It doesn't match their models at all. So they scratched their heads and said, well, maybe Voyager flew by just as Uranus's magnetic field was reversing. This would have been very unlikely, although not impossible. But then, 3 years later, Voyager arrived at Neptune, and guess what? Neptune's magnetic field is also tilted and offset from the planet's center. Evolutionists were forced to acknowledge that it seems that the possibility of finding 2 planets both experiencing magnetic polarity reversals is small. So far, we've seen that Neptune has produced lots of bad news for the evolutionary model. But there's an even bigger problem that I haven't told you about yet. According to evolutionary models, Neptune can't exist at all. Here's how Astronomy Magazine explained it. Psst. Astronomers who model the formation of a solar system have kept a dirty little secret. Uranus and Neptune don't exist. Or at least computer simulations have never explained how planets as big as the 2 gas giants could form so far from the sun. Bodies orbited so slowly in the outer parts of the sun's protoplanetary disk that the slow process of gravitational accretion would need more time than the age of the solar system to form bodies with 14.5 and 17.1 times the mass of Earth. Did you catch that? According to evolution, Uranus and Neptune don't exist. Well, last time I checked, both planets were still up there in the sky. Evolutionists are unhappy that their model is such a failure. As one evolutionary astronomer has commented, what is clear is that simple banging together of planetesimals to construct planets takes too long in this remote outer part of the solar system. The time needed exceeds the age of the solar system. We see Uranus and Neptune, but the modest requirement that these planets exist has not been met by this model. Let's ask an important question here. How long has this problem been known? Here's another evolutionist. There have been many attempts to model the evolution of a swarm of colliding planetesimals. Safronov calculated the characteristic timescales for planetary growth. In the terrestrial region, he found timescales of 10 to the 7 years. That's a 1 with 7 zeros after it. But the time estimates increased rapidly in the outer regions of the solar system and was 10 to the 10 years for Neptune, which is twice the age of the solar system. It is clear that in view of the large timescales found for the formation of the outer planets, a satisfactory theoretical model for the accretion of planets from diffuse material is not available at present. Okay, so this problem was first discovered by a scientist named Safronov. Was this a recent discovery? Nope. Safronov published this in 1972, so evolutionists have known for over 30 years that Uranus and Neptune can't exist, according to their models. Did you hear about this in Time magazine, or in the newspaper, or in a science program? I bet you haven't. In fact, I bet you've been told the opposite. I bet you've been told that evolutionists have the entire solar system figured out, and that they know exactly how it all formed all by itself billions of years ago. Now you know that this is a falsehood.
And so not only is it 30 years ago, it's 50 years ago at this point. And not only is it a falsehood, but these planets that their own solar nebular theory cannot account for are planets like all the planets in our solar system that each in their own unique way screams, this is a young creation. Now, before we move away from our solar system, we need to talk about our sun. Obviously, the star at the center of our solar system, it's nearly a perfect sphere of hot plasma with internal convection motion that generates a magnetic field via a dynamo process. It is by far, far and away the most important source of energy for life on Earth. Obviously, there would be no life on Earth without the sun. Its diameter, 1.39 million kilometers. It's 109 times that of Earth. Its mass is about 330,000 times that of Earth. It accounts for 99.86 of the total mass of our solar system. It is massive. But as far as stars go, there's stars that are bigger than our sun. Here's a picture of our sun. That's a solar flare, and you're kind of wondering, wow, I wonder how big that is. Well, let me help you. There's Earth, if we were there underneath that solar flare. That gives you an idea of the mass of the sun compared to the Earth. That gives you an idea of the size of that solar flare. And again, the sun is massive, but there's stars that are definitely much bigger. But as you think about the mass, this is the sun compared to the other planets. There's Earth. You can see the arrow there. Again, representing 98.86% of the total mass of our solar system in the sun. Here's the sun against Sirius. So Sirius is a much bigger star, but it's not just Sirius. There's much bigger ones than that. This is our sun. You can see Pollux and Arcturus. There's Betelgeuse. You can no longer see our sun. It's just a pixel there. This is really to give you an idea. Our sun is a G-type main sequence star on the spectral class. So this is a spectral class, and our sun is a G2 main sequence. Our sun is right here. But more than just being the right size, our sun is the right kind of star at the right distance to support life here on Earth. We talked about it early in our lessons. It exists, or we exist, in what's called the Goldilocks zone. We have the right star at the right distance to support life. But there's a paradox and there's a problem for the evolutionary model if the sun is 4.6 billion years old. In fact, this creates a serious problem. This next video is from Creation Moments. The speaker is Ian Taylor, and he briefly discusses this problem.
How did we survive before the sun got brighter? An evolutionary problem on today's Creation Moments. And now, here's our Creation Moments host, Ian Taylor.
Let's assume for a moment that the evolutionary explanation for the origin of the Earth and the Sun is correct. The Sun formed about 4.6 billion years ago. Let's imagine that evolutionists are right in saying that life originated on Earth about 3.5 billion years ago. This scenario creates many scientific problems, but today we want to focus on one problem that is seldom mentioned. One implication of these assumptions is that the Sun today is about 40% brighter than it was 4.5 billion years ago. This means that 3.5 billion years ago, the Sun was bathing the Earth in considerable less energy than we receive today. Under those conditions, life as we know it today could not have existed. Yet, we are told that it was under these very conditions that life supposedly evolved. Evolutionists are aware of this problem. In an attempt to solve it, they theorize that the early Earth had more greenhouse gases, which would have held the Sun's heat more efficiently and produced the same temperature range that life enjoys today. They then theorize that the mix of these these gases gradually changed to the atmosphere we have today at the same rate that the sun was sending more energy to Earth. This explanation is so unlikely that one scientific paper actually referred to it as the Goldilocks syndrome. There is a much less fantastic solution to this problem. The Earth and the Sun are not billions of years old, and life was created relatively recently to live under the conditions we enjoy today.
So not only does the Earth inhabit the Goldilocks zone, but here we have this Goldilocks theory on how to have a sun that's 4.6 billion years old and still have life evolve on this planet, which is absolutely impossible. So to talk a little bit more about this, so obviously energy is by thermonuclear fusion. The core of the sun would alter and the sun would grow brighter with age. If the sun is 4.6 billion years old, it would have increased in brightness over that time by 40%. Now that is significant. And so as you think about this movie, the average temperature right now, 59 degrees Fahrenheit. A 25% increase in brightness increases the average temperature by 32 degrees over that period of time. That would mean that the average temperature 3.2 billion years ago was 27 degrees. That creates a serious problem. And again, the idea that the gases changed as the energy from the sun changed to provide a temperature range like we see today is indeed the Goldilocks syndrome. But it's a joke. This planet would have been locked, would have been a frozen wasteland, and life would have never evolved here if the sun indeed is 4.6 billion years ago. Science, knowledge about the natural world that is based on facts learned through experiments and observation. These claims that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old do not fit the definition of science in any way. I have a theory. Life could have never evolved on a frozen tundra. The sun is young, less than 10,000 years old, and scientific evidence will not support it being 4.5 billion years old. While we're still in the solar system, let's talk about comets. Now, comets are small solar system bodies made up of ice, dirt, and rock. That ice, dirt, and rock warms and actually off-gasses as it passes near the sun. In fact, that process is called outgassing. Each time a comet drives past the sun, material is blasted off that comet. Thus, comets can only last so long. The best estimate is about 10,000 years, maybe longer, but not a whole lot longer. Here's some just pictures of different comets as they get close to the sun and that material is being blown off. That can be just beautiful, vivid tails, really just amazingly beautiful. But again, as that material is being blown off, that the nucleus is getting smaller and smaller. A comet might last 10,000 years, but 4.5 billion years? That's not possible. There should be no comets after so much time. This next clip, again, from Spike Passaris, and he discusses where evolutionary models believe comets come from.
So where are all these nuclei? Evolutionists believe that they're in two different places, the Oort cloud and the Kuiper belt. Evolutionary models need both of these sources to explain comets, and recent discoveries have disproved both of them. We'll start with the so-called Oort cloud, named after the astronomer who first invented this idea. He figured that there must be a huge cloud of comet nuclei way out in a large sphere-shaped cloud surrounding the solar system. The Oort cloud has three major problems. Number one, it's never been seen. As the late astronomer Carl Sagan wrote, many scientific papers are written each year about the Oort cloud, its properties, its origin, its evolution. Yet there is not yet a shred of direct observational evidence for its existence. Why hasn't anybody ever seen it? Because according to evolutionary models, it's impossible to see it or measure it, because it's too far away. You just have to accept it on faith and believe it exists. Remember that the next time somebody challenges you for believing in creation, because it's religious and not scientific. The evolutionary model actually requires more faith than the creation model. Anyway, that's problem number one with the Oort cloud. Problem number two was just discovered recently. The evolutionary model says that comets originally formed in the T&O region, which is why we're talking about comets now in the TNO part of our tour. But the Oort cloud is supposedly much farther out than that and surrounds the Sun in a huge sphere. How did all the comets get way out there? Evolutionists used to think that the comets migrated out there after they formed, but scientists have now realized this is impossible. It turns out that in the evolutionary model, there would be a lot of collisions along the way, and few comet nuclei would survive the trip. They'd be smashed into powder instead. The Oort cloud, even if it did exist, would have far too few comet nuclei. It couldn't supply the comets that evolutionists need for their billions of years. Problem number 3 is that many comets couldn't have come from an Oort cloud. These comets are called short period comets because they orbit the Sun in a short period of time, 200 years or less. Short period comets don't last long. As I mentioned earlier, they can only go around the Sun a certain number of times before they're destroyed or leave the solar system completely. A maximum lifespan for a short period comet has been estimated to be 10,000 years or less. Obviously, if the solar system was really billions of years old, we wouldn't see these comets anymore, unless there was a constant supply of new ones coming in to replace the old. However, a few years ago, evolutionists realized that the Oort cloud couldn't supply them. Short period comets have certain orbital characteristics that make it impossible for them to have come from an Oort cloud, which is way out there in space. So, most evolutionists today also believe in something called the Kuiper belt. This would be a disk of comet nuclei orbiting out beyond Neptune in the TNO region that we've been talking about. Again, these have been sitting out there quietly for billions of years, but every once in a while, one of them gets disturbed, moves in closer to the Sun, and turns into a comet. Therefore, says the evolutionist, it's no problem that we still see short-period comets today. Yes, they only last for a few thousand years once they start orbiting closer to the Sun, but there's an endless supply waiting out beyond Neptune to keep replenishing them. Unfortunately for evolution, recent discoveries have shown the Kuiper belt model doesn't work any better than the Oort cloud did. First of all, NASA and other space agencies have been busy in the last few years studying comets. We've actually visited several comets with spacecraft. We sent the Deep Impact spacecraft to crash a probe into a comet called Tempel 1 to see what we could learn about the comet's structure. In an even more amazing feat, the Stardust spacecraft recently visited the Wild 2 comet. The probe actually flew through the comet's tail, collected material from it, and brought it back to Earth. Evolutionists were shocked when they examined this material. Remember, in the evolutionists' story, comets were formed in the outer reaches of the solar system. The evolutionary model says that things that formed way out there must contain certain elements and must not contain certain other elements. Well, we've discovered that comets aren't like this. The volatile materials that evolutionists expected to find in the comet's tail were either rare or non-existent. On the other hand, most of the material was made up of silicates that the evolutionary model says can't have been out there where comets were supposedly born. So in many ways, comets have turned out to be the direct opposite of what the evolutionary model predicted. But there's another problem too. The Hubble Space Telescope was recently used in a massive search for comet nuclei to confirm that they're actually there. The search was the biggest study that anybody had ever done of the TNO region, so far out there in space. Evolutionists expected to find about 85 comet nuclei in the region they searched. How many did they actually find? Only 3. This has massive implications. Even the scientists in charge of the project admitted that this is serious trouble for the overall idea of comet nuclei out there. These results mean that the number of comet nuclei is at least hundreds and possibly even thousands of times less than the number required for supplying short-period comets. The project's report said that the number of nuclei found was, quote, wildly inconsistent, unquote, with what evolutionists had expected. This means that evolutionists have no source for short-period comets. Therefore, they can't explain how we still see comets today after billions of years, even though these comets burn up after only thousands of years. Maybe it's because the solar system isn't really billions of years old.
In 1950, based on a study of the orbit of several long-period comets, the Dutch astronomer Jan Oort proposed, and by proposed I mean hoped, wished, and prayed, that a great spherical shell of comets existed at the remote frontiers of our solar system, and the purpose was that would replace the burned out ones. No one has ever seen this Oort cloud. In fact, it's hard to see a comet at 1 astronomical unit from the Earth. Oort never saw the Oort cloud. Oort proposed this cloud of comets surrounding the solar system based on mathematical error and the absolute need to have these, because otherwise comets are screaming that the creation is young. Science is defined as knowledge about the natural world that's based on facts learned through experiments and observation. Is the Oort cloud in the Kuiper belt science? I have two theories. Theory number one. The reason we have not been able to detect the Oort cloud is because there's no Oort cloud. Theory number two. The reason we find comets in our solar system that all scientists would agree can only last thousands of years is because, exactly, our solar system is at most 10,000 years, definitely more than 6,000 years old. Now, maybe at this point, the question is, well, what is the most compelling evidence outside of radiometric dating of an old creation? And keep in mind, even when we talk about radiometric dating, a completely flawed process, most of the time, when you really look at what they're doing, they're not even using radiometric dates. They're using the geometric column that was created by James Hutton in 1795 and perfected by Charles Lyell. They're dating things based on a supposed date made up in the 17th century. I mean, this is circular reasoning at its best. But what is the most compelling evidence of an old creation? Or if I were to state it differently, as you consider a creation that's greater than 6,000 years old, but less than 10,000 years old, what would you wonder about? I mean, if someone convinced you this is absolutely true, what kind of things would come into your mind? You go, yeah, but what about that? That's kind of what I thought about. And here are the what-abouts that I thought about. I thought about dinosaurs. What about them? What about coal? What about oil? What about diamonds? What about petrified items? What about fossils? What about the fact that we see distant starlight? Those are the 7 that come to my mind that need to be answered. Now, we've answered most of them. We'll talk through all of them. But I have saved number 7 to a video all by itself because it's worthy of a greater discussion. It's very complex. So let's kind of work our way, though, through these first 6 what-abouts. What about dinosaurs? So according to evolutionary theory, the dinosaurs lived between 240 and 60 million years ago during the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods when they abruptly went extinct. Again, those names, I think, were made by Charles Lyell in the 1800s, completely just fabricated out of whole cloth, not based on any radiometric dating at all. Now, I put together a 1-hour lesson on dinosaurs. A great deal of evidence that dinosaurs live with man. The Bible indicates that dinosaurs existed with man. And the evidence further indicates that dinosaurs lived thousands, not hundreds of thousands or even millions of years ago. So I would refer you to that video. But I do want to remind you of what really the straw that broke the camel's back as it relates to evidence of dinosaurs living recently. And that was in 2003 when Dr. Jack Horner was overseeing the excavation of a T-Rex in Montana at Hell's Creek. Because the femur of that T-Rex was so large, they were not able to get the femur out using the helicopter that they had at their disposal, so they had to break that femur so they could lift it with a helicopter. A few of the small pieces from that break were flown back to Dr. Mary Schweitzer. She was an assistant colleague of Dr. Jack Horner. Now, in the lab, she made a mistake that changed everything. And it was because of that mistake that she detected tissue, blood vessels, and even blood cells from a T-Rex. This is an article that was ran in one of the newspapers. I don't remember exactly which one. It may say on there. Doesn't matter, though. You can see what it says. Soft tissue discovered in bone of dinosaur intact after 70 million years. It talks about being a T-Rex. And you can see the pictures. I mean, look at the blood vessels with actually blood cells in the vessel. I mean, this is amazing stuff. This is really some of the evidence that, and really, and as far as I know, the first evidence that then caused people to start looking into these fossils and finding stuff that was not completely fossilized. Here's a close-in picture, an actual photomicrograph of what appears to be red blood cells inside the blood vessel. These are, again, we're within an unfossilized section of that T-Rex. All tests to date have been consistent with finding red blood pigment, hemoglobin, is present. How can that be in bone that's 70 million years old? Amazing. Biological materials that survive 70 million years. It is funny as you think about this and looking at this evidence, the same people can look at the same material and come to two very different conclusions. I would argue that the most logical conclusion is that the bones are very young. Again, as you think about science, knowledge about the natural world that's based on facts learned through experiments and observation. As you think about dinosaurs and you think about T-Rex, and again, there's more on the video. These are facts we're learning through experiments that are repeatable and observations. We now have many dinosaurs that are producing various genetic material, including even DNA. And when I say dinosaurs, of course, I mean dinosaur fossils and non-fossilized materials. I have a theory. The reason we are finding blood vessels, blood cells, bone tissue, and even traces of DNA in dinosaurs that are supposedly 60 to 80 million years old and even older is because, they're not 60 to 80 million years old. They're not even hundreds of thousands of years old. They're simply thousands of years old. And even DNA surviving that length is rather amazing. Well, so that's dinosaurs. What about coal formation? So question, how long does it take to form coal? The pat answer, between 60 and 300 million years old, or years. In fact, this is reference.com. How long does it take to make coal? You can see the answer down here. Let me blow that up for you. The coal formation process takes millions of years. The coal in use today started to form over 300 million years ago as living trees, ferns, and other types of plant material. Coal is a non-renewable source because the time it required for formation far exceeds the rate at which man uses it. 300 million years, that's the pat answer. Really? This next video clip is about coal formation. It's from the DVD, The Young Age of the Earth, and it discusses research involving the formation of coal. The video producer, his photo is there, is Dr. Robert Gentry. You'll see his son in the video here in a minute.
One of the earliest reports about their work appeared in the magazine Chemical and Engineering News in the November 21, 1983 issue. On page 42 of this issue, we read the following quote. Chemists at Argonne National Laboratory have succeeded in making a type of artificial coal from naturally occurring materials. The process is much less severe than formerly thought to be necessary and provides some new insights into coal structure and how to alter it. Later, after their published reports appeared in the science journal Organic Geochemistry, the British science journal Nature reported on the success of their experiments. On page 316 of the journal Nature, March 28, 1985, we read the following. Winans and his colleagues at Argonne National Laboratory have taken less than 1 year to prepare a thoroughly characterized synthetic coal. The material they produce is indistinguishable from the real thing by all the techniques so far applied to it, and its synthesis raises many interesting questions in coal chemistry. To understand their results, let's first note the basic structure of wood. Two major wood components are cellulose and lignin. The lignin basically acts as a binding agent for the cellulose fibers. Several variations of the argon experiment were run, but the successful formula combined lignin and clay with heat, about 150 degrees Celsius, in the absence of oxygen. Over a period of about 8 months, artificial coal was produced.
8 months. 300 million years? 8 months. Coal that's indistinguishable from natural coal.
One of the earliest reports about their work appeared in the magazine Chemical.
So using real science, knowledge about the natural world is based on facts learned through experiments and observation. As you think about the formation of coal, 300 million years old or repeatable in 8 months, which one is science? I have a theory. The reason we're able to create coal in a lab setting in a very short amount of time is because natural coal was created in a very short amount of time. reminding us that the creation is very young. Noah's flood created the situation where the vast coal seams that we have today were created. All of this screams a young creation. So that's coal formation. What about oil formation? So the question, how long does oil take to form? The pat answer, between 65 million and 150 million years old. I should say, really. I'll go to reference.com. How long does it take for oil to form? About 70% of the current oil deposits derive from the Mesozoic period, which lasted from 65 million to 150 million years ago. There it is blown up for you. Really. This next piece about oil formation is from the same video, The Young Age of the Earth. Again, this video picks up where the discussion about coal ended and discusses the formation of oil.
The rapidity with which coal can form when steam interacts with wood under pressure leads us to ask, can steam or hot water also produce the rapid transformation of organic matter to oil? An article, Water, Water, Everywhere, published in the February 20, 1993 issue of Science News answers this question. Researchers at Exxon discovered water acted an essential part in the formation of oil. Efforts to synthesize oil met with failure until very hot water was added to the reactor vessel containing the source rock sample. When this was done, a layer of oil was found on top of the water at the end of the experiment. This result proves there is an alternate path to the production of oil in the earth, with superheated water playing a major role. The article indicated this discovery could wreak havoc with established ideas about oil formation. Actually, however, other natural events are already wreaking havoc with conventional theories. Incredibly enough, certain researchers, one at Oregon State University, have published reports showing evidence of present-day oil formation in the Guaymas Basin in the Gulf of California. Right now, in the Gulf of California, below 6,000 feet of water, is an accumulation of organic sediments derived from marine algae and other organic sources. Below this, superheated water is being pushed up by deep heat source through these sediments. Oil is being formed in the interaction of organic sediments with superheated water. This hydrothermal oil from the Guaymas Basin is virtually indistinguishable from crude oils obtained from wells drilled in the earth. The implications of this discovery can hardly be overestimated. The possibility must be entertained that the genesis of the reservoir crude oils abundant throughout the world may be explained by hydrothermal processes similar to what's happening in the Guaymas Basin. But instead of an open dispersion of oil directly into the seawater, a closed system could easily be visualized where a reservoir of crude could be collected. It is conceivable that a worldwide flood was instrumental in the production of the tremendous oil reserves of the Middle East and elsewhere. The vast amounts of vegetation buried by such a flood, mixed with superheated water similar to that detected in the Guaymas Basin, could produce oil in the volumes we see today. Depending on the burial conditions, the organic matter would be transformed to either oil or coal. Is there a model of Earth history incorporating these features? One which allows the formation of the world's large oil and coal reserves over a much shorter time than has been previously thought possible?
What about a model based on the record of Earth's history given in Genesis? The Bible describes Earth being called into existence about 6,000 years ago, an Earth originally covered with lush vegetation, then devastated by a worldwide flood about 1,700 years later. This timescale certainly fits with all the scientific discoveries I've made, and just as certainly, water once covered this Earth. In 1927, Noel Odell discovered marine shelly fossils near the very top of Mount Everest. Mountains rising out of the waters is how the Bible describes the end of the worldwide flood. According to that description, the shells near the top of Mount Everest are no surprise at all. And coal and oil, are they the result of the rapid devastation and burial of lush vegetation by a worldwide flood?
I would submit that's exactly what they are. So how fast can oil form? Well, researchers from Battelle Laboratories in Richland, Washington are able to convert raw sewage into usable crude oil in 2 days. Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Laboratories in Sydney, Australia has been able to rapidly produce oil from oil shale, turbinite, and a brown coal lignite. Using real science, knowledge about the natural world that's based on facts learned through experiments and observation, experiments that are repeatable. So I have a theory. The reason we were able to create oil in a lab setting in a very short amount of time, and we can see it created instantly in nature, is because our oil reserves were created in a very short amount of time, reminding us that the creation itself is very young. Diamonds. So what about diamonds? How long does it take to form a diamond? Obviously synthetic diamonds, hours to days at the most, but natural, we're told 1 to 3.5 billion years. Really. We have done radiocarbon dating on a number of different diamonds at this point in time. All of them return ages. Again, we talked about radiometric dating. You cannot get an age any greater than, let's say, 100,000 years old, even with AMS technology. And yet we continue to get dates from the diamonds that we've dated. This is an article at creation.com. Diamonds, a creationist's best friend. This is an article at Answers in Genesis. Radiocarbon in diamonds confirmed. This is an article at Institute for Creation Research. Diamonds in strata have too much carbon-14. Again, diamonds are indeed screaming that the creation is young. So we talked about carbon-14 dating in the video about carbon-14 dating, and carbon-14 dating points to a young creation. To date, at this point, we've performed carbon-14 dating on a number of natural diamonds. Excuse me, all have returned to date. In fact, coal, oil, fossils, and all of these things return carbon-14 dates, and they should not. Using real science, knowledge about the natural world based on facts learned through experiments and observation that's repeatable, I have a theory. The reason diamonds return a carbon-14 date when they should not due to their supposed age of billions of years is because, the creation is young. Well, what about petrified items? How long does that take? So how long does it take for the petrification process? Here's where I found an answer. It happened to be on Wikipedia, highly trusted, right? Petrification takes place through a combination of two similar processes, permeabilization and replacement. These processes create replicas of the original specimen that are similar down to the microscopic level, and it requires about 10,000 years to take place. Okay, so that's not that old, but it is definitely at the outer edge of the age of the creation. But does it really take that long? Here's a petrified boiler's hat from New Zealand, found in a spray mine. Clearly not 10,000 years old. Petrified flour, again in the right circumstances, in the right situation. They believe this was about 1903, so we're talking about a little over 100 years. This is a petrified pickle that was found in this jar. Someone had actually taken a bite out of the pickle and then left it. The liquid evaporated and it left behind a petrified pickle. How about a petrified teddy bear? A different petrified teddy bear, a petrified rose, like the rose you make with a napkin. Here's a petrified rope. You see, we can petrify products very quickly with the exact same process, the permeabilization in the right circumstances. So using real science, knowledge about the natural world that's based on facts learned through experiments and observations that's repeatable, we now know about fossilization. So I have a theory. Even things that we have been taught require long periods of time. Observable, repeatable science says otherwise, declaring to us that the creation is indeed less than 10,000 years old. Well, what about all the sheets of ice in Greenland and those ice core drillings? Okay, great question. This is the National Snow and Ice Data Center. Ice sheets form in areas where snow that falls in the winter does not melt entirely over the summer. Over thousands of years, the layers of snow pile up into thick masses of ice, growing thicker and denser as the weight of the new snow and the ice layers compress the older layers. That makes sense. The two ice sheets on the Earth today cover most of Greenland and Antarctica. Evolutionists teach that Greenland has been covered in ice for more than 18 million years, and that the current ice can be as old as 100,000 years old. Really? Okay, so let's just get our bearings. We're talking about the Greenland ice sheet up at the top, the Antarctic ice sheet down at the bottom. This is the U.S. Naval Ice Core Laboratory. This is a giant freezer where they store these ice cores. It's located in Denver, Colorado. This is where we've done ice core drilling in Greenland. Here's a picture of the machine that actually, you can see the cutout there, right here, and they spin this barrel over and keep drilling deeper and deeper. They've taught that the layers represent annual rings. Because of the summer, the top layer of snow melts and refreezes as clear ice, which shows up dark. In the winter, the snow packs and shows up as the white layer. So summer, and there's winter, and you can follow it, right? And so that's what we've been taught. That's what they teach. In Greenland and Antarctica, where the weather is consistently dry and very cold, the glaciers are miles thick, but the annual rings are very thin. The deepest cores can measure over 10,000 feet, showing what the climate looked like 135,000 years ago. Really? Well, that's not what we learned from the Lost Squadron. And I don't know if you've ever heard about the Lost Squadron, but this next video clip from Creation Magazine Live is going to really let you in on this little secret. This is Richard Fangrand and Calvin Smith, and they'll be talking about the Lost Squadron.
Welcome to Creation Magazine Live. My name is Richard Fangrad.
And I'm Calvin Smith.
Now, this week on Creation Magazine Live, our topic is really about the Ice Age in the Bible, and we'll get there later. We want to begin with the amazing account of the Lost Squadron, as it's come to be known.
Yeah, this story helps to demonstrate that the biblical history is far superior explanation for the example, the massive buildup of ice on Greenland, which is in some areas more than 10,000 feet thick. So let's begin with the account of the Lost Squadron. We'll read portions of an article from a June 1997 issue of Creation Magazine, and then we'll go from there. From a secret U.S. Army air base in Greenland, 6 P-38 Lightning fighter planes and 2 gigantic B-17 Flying Fortress bombers rose into the early dawn. The date was the 15th of July, 1942, and they were headed for a British airfield to join the war against Hitler.
Now, the P-38 Lightning was one of the deadliest planes to come out of World War II. It was powered by twin Allison V-12 engines. It had one 20-millimeter cannon and 4 50 caliber machine guns in its nose, and it was operational from 1941 to 49. The nickname given to it by German pilots because of its double tail was der Gabelschwanzteufel, which means the forked-tongued devil.
I remember having a model of one, and I thought it was a cool airplane. Anyway, the article continues. Heading east over the polar ice cap, they ran into a massive blizzard. Flying blind, they heard that their first planned refueling stop in Iceland was socked in, forcing them to return to their home base. As they approached this, however, critically low on fuel, they found that it, too, was closed. Realizing that their only hope was to crash land on the icy wastes of Greenland's east coast, they desperately searched till they found a break in the cloud cover.
The nose wheel of the first plane to land hit a crevice, which caused it to flip. And you can see a picture of that actual plane right here. Fortunately, the impact on the canopy of the 8-ton P-38 was cushioned by snow, and the pilot's injuries were minor. After they saw this, the rest of the squadron came in with their wheels up for belly landings. The planes were only lightly damaged, and all of the crewmen were rescued unharmed by dog sled about 9 days later. However, the planes had to be abandoned where they had slithered to a stop.
It continues. In the years to follow, a few people occasionally recalled the legendary Lost Squadron of 1942, but it was only in 1980 that anyone thought of a salvage mission. U.S. airplane dealer Patrick Epps told his friend, architect Richard Taylor, that the planes would be like new. All we have to do is shovel the snow off the wings, fill them with gas, crank them up, and fly them off into the sunset. Nothing to it.
Okay. Now, the P-38s are highly prized collector's items. Only 5 were believed to still be flying at the time that the Lost Squadron was salvaged. The article continues. It took the 2 of them many years, much money, and several failed expeditions before the first real clue came. Using a sophisticated form of radar with the help of an Icelandic geophysicist, they located 8 large shapes beneath the ice in 1988.
As a small makeshift steam probe began to melt a hole in the ice, expedition members watched dumbstruck as more and more extensions were added to the hose, some 75 meters or 250 feet before reaching the first airplane.
Okay, now here's a picture of what they call the gopher that melted the 250 deep, 4-foot diameter hole straight down through the ice to reach the aircraft. Hot water is pumped through the copper tubing you see there at the bottom end, and that's what melts the ice.
Right, and the article continues. None of the discoverers thought that the planes could possibly be buried under more than a light cover of snow and ice. And why would they? After all, the impression the general public has is that the buildup of glacial ice takes very long time periods, thousands of years for just a few meters. Well, this story vividly shows how the impression that, you know, this buildup of snow takes a long time. That's just the way people think about it because of what they've been taught by evolutionary teaching.
Exactly.
Okay, so again, we'll skip all the early part of the story, but they had to turn back because of bad weather, and that's where they crash landed. Again, it took many years and much money and expeditions to actually find the 8 objects. But ultimately, they did find them 263 feet of ice 48 years later. Now, these did not sink in the ice. They were setting there. They didn't sink at all. They're very heavy on the front end. If it was an issue of sinking, they would have sunk with the front end down. They were just covered in snow. 263 feet of ice and snow in that 48-year period. And that's just another article about the expedition. Here's a picture of the actual ice rings. You can see the guy who's been lowered down in there. Here's a little explanation of how they dismantled. They blew out, you know, the ice and all around them and dismantled the planes and took them out. But think about this: 48 years, and the planes were in 263 feet of snow and ice. So that's about 5.5 feet per year. If indeed the ice cap is 10,000 feet, which is what we're told, that's only 1,824 years to accumulate that based on the 5.5 feet per year. Now, deeper ice is pressed into thinner layers, but the bottom line is, even with a creation that's just a little over 6,000 years, 4,600 years ago, the flood works perfectly with what we're seeing with the ice. And you can see there, this was, they've been gone for 8 years, and during that 8 years, they put down plywood before they left, 62 feet of snow on that plywood cover. That's an average of 8 feet a year. Bob said in an interview there were many hundreds of layers of ice above the planes where they dug them out. He said 30 to 40 rings accumulated in the 8 years between, expeditions. Science. Knowledge about the natural world based on facts learned through experiments and observation. Again, not what we're told, what we can prove scientifically. So I have a theory. The massive ice sheet that covers Greenland was created post-flood, and observable, measurable science demands that it is recent. Well, what about the world's oldest tree? I mean, surely that's hundreds of thousands of years old or more, right? So the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, we're told. How old do you think the oldest tree ever found is? I'll give you a chance to think about it. At one time, it was believed to be the General Sherman, located in Sequoia National Forest. It is the largest tree on the planet. In fact, it's the largest living thing on the planet. Weight estimate was 1,385 tons. That was in 2005 when I was there. It may be a little bigger and heavier than that now. The circumference at the time was 102.6 feet. It's probably bigger. It's an original generation, no previous stumps. But how old do you think this thing is? I mean, 102.6 foot circumference. Well, it was originally thought to be 5,000 to 6,000 years old, then approximately 2,500 years old. New tests have showed about 2,000 rings. If you look at the plaque that's there at the General Sherman, it says between 2,300 and 2,700 years old. But now the oldest tree that we've ever found is the Methuselah tree. So it's a pine tree. I think it's a bristle pine. The current estimate is about 4,600 years old. So consider that. This is the oldest living thing that we're aware of. Now, tree ring dating is not exact science. Trees often produce more than one ring in a year, and we know that. We've observed that scientifically. Here, this article says that it's 4,300 years old from this textbook. And again, 4,300 would be the max if we go with the youngest age of the Earth. The current estimate on the tree, and I'm sorry, I'm still talking, leave the picture up, is it's 5,066 years. Here's the deal. It fits well within our understanding of the age of the Earth and the time since the flood. Isn't it interesting that the oldest tree we can find on the planet fits within the time range since the flood? I have a theory. The reason the oldest tree on the planet dates back to roughly the flood is because that was when it started to grow, pointing to the veracity of the scriptures and the young age of the creation. Okay, well, what about stalactites and stalagmites? Those things take a long time to form. In fact, according to the Bulletin on National Speleological Society, observable growth rates range from 0.1 to 10 centimeters per 1,000 years. So we're talking a couple of inches per 1,000 years. How long does it take to stalactites and stalagmites to form? Well, again, Science Focus tells us they're extremely slow in forming, less than 10 centimeters every 1,000 years. Again, there's that answer, just a couple of inches every 1,000 years. Here's a textbook. New Mexico's unfinished symphony was started 250 million years ago. And by the way, Carlsbad Cavern is awesome if you've ever been there. And you can imagine as you look at these things that go from ceiling to floor, at a couple of inches per 1,000 years, they must be massively old. In his book, Caving into Reality, quote, what geologists used to believe was fact in terms of dating a cave now is speculation, Trout says. From 1924 to 1988, there was a visitor sign above the entrance to Carlsbad Caverns that said Carlsbad was at least 260 million years old. In 1988, the sign was changed to read 7 to 10 million years old. Then for a little while, the sign read that it was 2 million years old. Now the sign is gone. I've told many of you the story. We were with a guide in Carlsbad Cavern, and he was telling us about the very slow formation of stalactites and stalagmites. Again, the standard answer, a couple inches per 1,000 years. And there was chain link fence there that prevented you, from getting into dangerous areas. And there were actually stalactites that were hanging down the chain link fence. I mean, they were like, a foot long, 14, 16 inches long. And I asked him, I said, well, what about these? And I pointed at these stalagmites that are on this chain link fence that was clearly installed recently. And he didn't say a word. He just looked at me like I was crazy. Continuing on with caving in reality, Trout says, in short, geologists don't know how long cave developments takes. And while some believe that cave decorations, such as beautiful icicle-looking stalactites, took years to form, Trout says that through photo monitoring, he has watched a stalactite grow several inches in a matter of days. This is a picture from the Lincoln Memorial, built in 1922. The photo was in 1960. That's not thousands of years, and that's definitely more than 2 inches. This is the George Rogers Clark Memorial in Indiana, built 40 years from when this photo was taken. Clearly, that is more than a couple of inches in just 40 years. This is TP Fountain. It was started in 1903. A guy drove a pipe in his front yard, and it started forming like a rock pyramid of deposits of travertine. This is a picture of it when it was 90 years old. Again, this is in his front yard. As you can imagine, that's definitely more than a couple of inches per 1,000 years. Here's a photo taken in 1998. That's definitely, it was started in 1903. A couple of years later, a guy down the street started one. You know, everybody wants to have a rock formation in their front yard. Science. Knowledge about the natural world is based on facts learned through experiments and observation. It's repeatable. How long do stalactites and stalagmites take to form? This is, silly. I have a theory. Stalactite and stalagmite formations can happen very rapidly. Measurable, observable, and repeatable science denies an old age of these things. Now, we are, at this point, we're really out of time. I had a few other things I wanted to talk about, but as I was preparing, as I finished this video, I realized I'm way over time. So I just kind of cut these up and cut it off. But we could talk about ancient graves. We could talk about written language and the age of language. We could talk about the makeup of our oceans as just a few more things. And there's even many more things that I don't touch upon. Here's the point. Oh, I'm not even going to go there. I'm sorry. I'm going to end here. But here's the point. I have a theory. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That beginning, man's beginning, our beginning, the beginning of our creation, the beginning of the entire cosmos, the beginning of earth, was greater than 6,000 years ago and less than 10,000 years ago. And looking at science, observable, repeatable, we've looked at a number of different things. There is a ton of evidence that demands that the creation is young. God bless you guys. I look forward to seeing you in class on Sunday. God bless.